Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
And I'm Gini Dietrich.
And after lots of technical glitches, we finally got the intro to this show kicked off. If only you had been here to see how the last 90 seconds have gone with false starts and stops. And so hopefully we will actually make it all the way through this recording such that you can listen to it.
Whew, yeah, you'd think we'd never introduced ourselves before. That was a comedy of errors.
Well, at least I introduced myself by my correct name and didn't introduce myself as you, for example. That would be...
Well, that's true. That would be awkward, yeah.
Yes. But
so Chip,
that's sort of a parallel for the times in which we live, right? It's things are just a little bit crazy, and who knows what's happening from day to day, so why should we know how our show is going to go?
Yes. Mm-hmm. It's a little crazy right now.
And so that craziness is sort of kind of what we're going to talk about today. And I know we've talked about it a bit over the last couple of months, but we really wanted to try to peer into the crystal ball a little bit and look ahead to the next few months and see what we see. And this was really spurred by the news that came out this past week that Edelman is going back on their pledge not to do any layoffs during this economic shock, and instead will be cutting, I guess, about 7% of their global workforce. So, not an insignificant staff cut, and obviously lots of good people will be impacted by that. But I think it's a signal that the rest of the agency community needs to be looking at.
Yeah, it's I've as we both have been watching this pretty carefully, and it's sad. I have some personal friends who have been affected by this for sure. It's interesting, though, to look at things like 7% is a single digit from a layoff perspective. So when you put it into that, when you look at it from that perspective, it's not terrible. It's terrible when you think about the friends that have lost their jobs in a time like this, which is just a horrible time to lose your job in any case. But it's also, I think, really hard and admirable at the same time that Richard Edelman had to come out and say, hey, listen, I promised that we weren't going to do layoffs 2 months ago, and here we are, and I'm really sorry. And it's tough to have to lay on that sword and admit that you made that kind of mistake. That's tough.
Yeah, look, I mean, nobody wants to eat crow, right? That is probably one of the least pleasant things you can do in life, and certainly in business when you're as prominent as someone like he is. You that's something you want to avoid at all costs. But I think one of the points that he made in the announcement was that this is not 2001, this is not 2008, and so
that's a good point. Yep.
The same playbook.
Yep.
And frankly, that's something that you and I have been saying all along, that you can certainly learn lessons from that. And as someone who ran businesses in 2001, 2008, I think there's a lot of things that I can take away from that can still be applied today. But this is a very different kind of economic shock.
Yeah, that's a really good point. He did say, he said in an interview with, it was either Yahoo or PR Week, I can't remember, but said, I was going back to the playbook that we used in 01 and 08. And during those times, we had enough net margin and we had enough cash reserves to be able to get through these things so that we didn't have to lay people off. And so I was using that as the backdrop for these decisions. And it's not the same. And I agree with him from that perspective. It's not the same. And it's been interesting to see. And he did say, there are industries that we're doing really well in, but it's not making up for the losses. So it's been interesting to see, just from my perspective, the clients that we have that are doing really well, and then the clients that put us on pause on March 22nd and have not heard from again. Right.
Because as we've said, being put on pause is really the same as being fired, and you've got to earn that business back at some point. It sounds a lot kinder and gentler to say pause, just as a lot of agencies and other businesses are saying that they're furloughing employees. Look, I mean, a furlough is really just a layoff. It's done with the best of intentions, and certainly those businesses want to be bringing people back, just as the clients, I think, in most cases want to come back to their agencies. But the reality is that the environment is very different today than it was on March 1st. And certainly very different than it was on February 1st or January 1st, when there was absolutely no inkling of where we would be headed. March 1st, you started to get inklings, at least from some of the folks that I would have said at the time were doom and gloomers, Christopher Penn.
I have to say, though, I watched his, of course, because he's not only a friend, but I also sit on his board. And so I watched his stuff and I was like, can it really be this bad? And he was freaking right about everything. He called the masks ahead of time. He kept saying, wear a mask, wear a mask, wear a mask. And everybody kept saying, you don't have to wear a mask. And then they came out and said, this is a total side note, but he was right. He was completely right about all of it.
And I think my admitting that is probably more painful, or at least as painful as Griffin Edelman had to go back on, because I did think that he was an over the top scaremonger. At the
and he
time.
wasn't.
And he was
all.
not. He was not. Unfortunately, I really, really wish he had been wrong. It would have made the last few months.
Oh, for sure. But the thing with Chris Penn is he pays attention to the data and he lets the data tell the story, which is something that we all need to do. And he was right.
It is an abject lesson in the importance of data and looking at it and understanding it so that you can make accurate predictions about the future.
Right.
So, and that's not to say that Chris is right about absolutely everything. He's made some bad predictions about things too, but on this thing, he is so spot on in such a painful way.
Yes.
I'm sitting in my darkened home office right now, and I spend 18 hours a day here, 7 days a week. I have literally not been in a car since March 13th or 14th. Not even. I have not been more than walking distance around my house in, almost 3 months now. That's depressing.
It is almost 3 months on Sunday for us anyway.
Yeah. And next week I will get in a car though, because my eldest son is graduating from high school and they're doing some weird graduations.
Drive-by graduation
type thing. Yeah, they've got a couple of different approaches that they're taking, none of which is a real graduation, but hey, it is what it is. It's the times we live in. Yeah. But so speaking of those times we live in, and obviously, if Edelman has had to go back on this pledge, I think smaller agencies, as I've been saying now for quite some time, are going to have to do the same. So if you're a small agency and have not already downsized, chances are you're going to have to if you have seen meaningful revenue losses, because it's simply unsustainable. And I've talked to plenty of agency owners who have lost 20 or 30% of their revenue, and they're saying, look, we can weather this. I got to tell you, you're not going to weather this.
You're not going to weather it. Yeah.
You need to be looking at, as soon as possible, at getting your staff right-sized for the revenue that you have now and that you have for the foreseeable future. That doesn't mean that there's not a path out of this. I'm not a doom and gloomer here, but I do think you need to be thinking very carefully about how to get to that right size sooner than later, because the longer you wait, the less flexibility you have and the less you can treat your team right. Because if you take action now or soon, you can give your team members more runway. And obviously it's a terrible environment to be in, as far as looking for a job. So I wouldn't wish that on anybody. But at the same time, the more time you have to think about it, at least the more likely you are to find some manageable scenario for you and your family.
And look, there might even be an opportunity. I have several clients who solely use contractors, solopreneurs. Yep. And there might be an opportunity for you to help some of your employees become business certified, get their LLC or whatever happens to be, and get them a business account. And maybe, it might not be full time, but you can at least put them on part-time payroll, or, not payroll, but 1099, and continue to work with them, but at a decreased opportunity. So I think there is a lot of things to do from that perspective that you can do as well, without having to completely just let your team go.
Oh, absolutely. And look, there are agencies that are looking for help right now. So, for agencies that are, more focused on, crisis or, healthcare or some of these areas, they actually have seen an uptick in work. And, as I've said before, I don't think that's going to sustain. I think that, a lot of that's going to start, coming back to normal-ish, if you will. But there are still real opportunities out there that you ought to be thinking about taking advantage of if you are unemployed or underemployed, or if you're a solo, so look for those opportunities and take advantage of them.
And the other thing I will say is, if if you have an opportunity to take on some new business, find ways to be able to do it so that you can still make a profit on it, but maybe it's not at the full amount that you normally would charge. So, for instance, if you get somebody who calls and says, I'm looking for this particular thing and my budget is $5,000 for the project. Well, you might not be able to do it for $5,000 because they really want $50,000 worth of work. But is there something that you can do in there that allows you to bring in that cash, but doesn't require $50,000 worth of time to get it done?
Right. And I think that's absolutely critical. You've got to be focused on profitability for your current business. That's why you need to look at your staffing and resourcing right now. But you also need to look at profitability for the work that you're bringing on, because there is that unfortunate tendency when times get tough for business owners and general agency owners in particular to sharply discount prices in order to just get any revenue in the door. But bad revenue is just as bad today as it was 6 months ago, and so it may feel good to be able to have a check to go cash. But if more money is going out the door than is coming in, you're not putting yourself in a better situation than you had been.
But you can, for sure. I mean, if I just had this very thing happen where somebody said, my budget is $7,500. Can you do this, 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 and this? And I said, no, I mean, for $7,500, we can't do all of that, but we can do this or this. And they were like, okay, that makes sense. So, it's a 3-week project and we made $7,500. So I think there are opportunities if you're willing to open your brain a little bit and look for the opportunity and be a little creative. You do have to be creative. There are some ways that you can still make money, still make a profit on that kind of stuff and make a go of it.
Yeah, and I think one of the other important things here is that agency owners need to be very careful about negotiating against themselves right now, because the other thing that I have seen is situations where a contract's coming up for renewal, or you've been working on a project and you want to try to get that next project. And so I've seen some agency owners who have instinctively said, well, we need to find a way to offer this cheaper to my existing client going forward. And I don't think that you should come at it from the immediate assumption that you have to reduce your rates. There may well be an opportunity to, at the very least, hold steady, or in the case of one of the clients that I was working with in the last couple of weeks on a renewal, they actually managed to get more from the client than they had been paying previously because they added on additional work. And that was someone who was originally going into that renewal expecting that they were going to be reducing their fee with that client. And I said, well, hold on, stop, talk about, something to add on to. So you're at least starting from a better negotiating position. It doesn't mean that the client's not going to say, hey, look, we've got to be more cautious. We've got to cut back. But you shouldn't, until the client indicates that they need to cut back, you shouldn't be assuming it as the agency. You should be operating from a position of optimism and try to work to grow the accounts, or at least hold them steady, and only cut when you absolutely have to.
Yeah. And I would also add to that, I have another client who earlier this week had proposed a strategy session for a prospect. And they were like, yes, we want to do this. This makes a lot of sense. Everything. Can you reduce the price? And she was like, I can't. I can reduce the scope. Instead of doing it over 2 days, we could, reduce it and do it over a day. And instead of doing a full plan, I can give you an executive summary. I can reduce the price that way. And they're like, no, we want the full thing. And she's like, I can't reduce the price then. And they end up saying, okay, fine. And they paid for it. So just because they're asking doesn't necessarily mean that they won't pay for it. So find opportunities
I'd
there.
like a Ferrari for the price of a Kia, but it's probably not going to happen. And to be honest with you, I don't really want a Ferrari. They don't look particularly comfortable to sit in, and
you can't drive it all year. And if you go over a pothole, you really screw things up. And
I mean, where I live, I pretty much couldn't drive it at all. I don't even think I could get it up my driveway with as bumpy as my driveway is. It would bottom out. And the day I drove it home, I'd have to take it in for some $15,000 repair to the undercarriage.
Right.
Because I'm certainly not going to fix it myself, because I know nothing about cars. I tried to learn something about cars a couple of years ago, and then I realized that now everything is so fancy and computerized and tightly packed that you can't really service them yourself, even if you know what you're doing. So,
yeah.
But anyway,
so yes, you cannot buy a Ferrari on a Kia price.
Right. And so and you shouldn't expect that either. You also need to be careful, as always, of the notion that, well, I can just get them in the door cheap and then, get them back to regular pricing
Mm-mm.
after
Mm-mm.
things settle down. Ain't gonna
Never works.
happen.
Never
Nope.
works.
Nope. Nope.
Nope.
Now, I mean, you can do things where you're offering, less service in the short term, or, you can do things where there are explicit short term discounts more in the terms of payment terms, but it needs to be with an explicit, this is what the rates are, and it's not we'll figure it out later, because even with clients that you know well or think you know well, it's so hard to get someone to reframe their value proposition in their head for your services. So you got to
Absolutely. Yeah.
price it right from the gate.
Yeah. I have a client, he's been a client for 10 years, and we did that 10 years ago. And I have never in 10 years been able to get him to where he should be ever.
Right.
Yeah. And that's my own fault. And really, we keep him as a client because we love him and he's a great client. So it's fine. But because I did that 10 years ago, I have never been able to ever. And I even had the conversation with him, and he's like, I'm never paying you that amount of money. And I was like, okay.
Well, that's
right.
very direct. So, okay. So let's spend a little bit more time though looking out, over the next, 3-6 months. Where do you think we're going to be at the end of the year, as an industry? Do you see it, bouncing back? Do you see at some point people becoming more loose with their budgets? And obviously, a lot of this depends on, more macroeconomic issues that, you and I are not really qualified to judge. But, I think that even within the macro environment, there are still things that will take place in the agency industry that, maybe we can at least speculate about.
Well, in the PR Week article that interviewed Edelman, he talked about we would reevaluate around Christmas time. And the article was like, that seems a little soon. I agree with that. I think that honestly and truly, until there's a vaccine for COVID, I don't think there's any sort of normalcy in terms of outsourcing for agencies or spending or anything like that. And then it'll take another 18 to 24 months for that to come back around. So I think we're a good 3 years away, if not longer. That doesn't mean that we can't grow and that we won't increase our revenue or anything like that. It just means that what we knew in 2018 or 2019 and before is not on the forefront. Yeah,
well, I mean, I guess in some ways I'm more optimistic, in some ways I'm more pessimistic. So let me try to explain that a little bit. I think let's deal with the pessimism first. I think the path to complete recovery is much, much longer than that. I mean, I think we're, before we see the industry back to where it was 6 months ago, I think it's probably going to be 5, 6, 7 years before we get back to something like that industry-wide. But what I do think is I do think in the short term or shorter term, I think there are going to be pockets of growth that even start to appear as early as this fall. And I think the reason for that is that as you see other industries trying to claw their way back, they're going to need communications and marketing support in order to get there, and they're going to recognize that. And I think the likelihood is that on more project-oriented things, on more direct impact to the bottom line type communications and marketing, I think that will come back sooner, and really, I think it's going to start coming back in the fall to some degree. Not by any means a complete recovery, nothing like that. And you shouldn't be assuming that. But I think that while we've seen sort of an almost complete holding pattern the last few months with very teeny pockets of hope, I think that those pockets of hope will grow as we move into the fall and as people start to think in their own businesses about how to get out of it. So, I guess, so on the one hand, I'm more optimistic. On the other hand, I'm more pessimistic.
Well, I mean, there was a Wall Street Journal article that talked about it's going to be a decade before the economy recovers, before we get back to where we were in even February of this year. So I don't think you're wrong, unfortunately. And I think if you are wrong, great. We've helped people prepare, right? And it's better to be over-prepared than under-prepared. So I would consider that. And I would consider the types of things that we've talked about in this episode and, a few others about being helpful and offering services that you may not have offered before, finding ways to quote unquote package or create products, unbundling premium price products or services so that you can, charge less, but still deliver some of your value. Doing those kinds of things are going to allow you to survive this.
Right. And I think that, look, in any of these situations, you have winners and you have losers. So the playbook from 01 and 08 don't apply precisely, but the winners and losers part does. And Edelman was looking to be a big winner out of it by not laying off staff and trying to hold on to things. And they were very clear about that in their original announcement a few months ago. But there is an opportunity for agencies who are nimble, who are innovative, to even sooner than the end of the year start seeing some real acceleration in their businesses, because what folks need to be doing is they need to be thinking about how they can use their agency services to deliver more immediate results and impactful results.
Yes.
So the big, grand, long-term communications plans or marketing plans that are surrounding branding or things like that, those are going to be much slower to come back. The things that we've seen already doing well can continue. Things like crisis and reputation, absolutely, those are there. But from a communications and marketing standpoint, you need to be thinking about things that have a more direct and tangible benefit to the client, and that's going to help them increase donations, move the needle on their issues, make sales, whatever it is that they're trying to do. And so you really need to rethink how you're doing it and not think in these, grand long-term plans. Those will come back last. The first thing that will come back are the more targeted, project-oriented, results-driven activities. And frankly, that's something that agencies should have been looking at before this anyway, because the more that's your bread and butter, the more aggressively you can grow. That doesn't mean there's not a place for the long-term communications and branding play, but that should be layered on top of that other work for any agency.
100%. It's a total bummer to come full circle that Edelman had to make this announcement, but I think this is where it's very indicative of where we're headed. I don't think it's going to get better anytime soon. No,
and I think that it is important for all business owners, particularly agency owners, to be thinking about things from a realistic perspective. You need to sit there and say what is most likely to happen. And generally, when you're doing planning, it's better to assume the worst case, because you can always take advantage of best case scenarios. But if you're prepared for worst case, then you at least protect your downside and you survive to fight another day. So, be absolutely looking at that in the course of your business and say, okay, well, if these restrictions remain in place and the economy remains down for, 3, 6, 9, 18 months, how would I adjust to those? And think those scenarios through, because if you've got that, well put in your mind, you'll be in a much stronger position to make the adaptations that you need so that you can be in that winners column a year from now.
Yes. Different revenue streams. I'm a big fan.
Indeed. Well, on that note, we will bring to a close this episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. It's been a sobering conversation, but hopefully we've offered some useful tips for all of you. And it's definitely sobering. I have no alcohol anywhere around me right now. So. Which is good, because we're recording this in the morning.
It's noon there. It's noon. You could probably start drinking now.
Yeah, I have a general policy about not drinking before noon anywhere except in Las Vegas.
Fair.
Because
or on vacation. I'll do it on vacation.
Yeah,
the rules do not apply in Las Vegas,
but the rules do apply here, and so we will end this episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin,
and I'm Gini Dietrich,
and it depends.